Hi class, today we're going to be talking about the Hecksher-Ohlin model and a couple other models of note. So, first off, in addition, past models that we've talked about have talked about differences in labor productivity, but there's also the difference in resources across country. The Hecksher-Ohlin theory argues that trade occurs due to differences in labor skills, capital, physical capital, and other factors of production. So this assumes that countries have been endowed with a relative abundance of factors, and that production processes use factors of production with relative intensity. And these differ across countries. So we have a two-factor Hecksher-Ohlin model. We have two countries, home and foreign, two goods, cloth and food, two factors of production, labor and capital, and then the mix of labor and capital used will vary between the goods. Supply of labor and capital is held constant, but it varies across countries. In the long run, labor and capital move across sectors, equalizing their returns across sectors. So, let's look at the production possibilities. With one more factor of production, opportunity cost is no longer constant, and the PPF is no longer a straight line. So why? Well, let's take a numerical example where capital equals 3,000, which is the total amount of capital. Labor equals 2,000, which is the total amount of labor. So suppose we use a fixed mix of capital and labor in each sector. Capital used to produce 1 yard of cloth equals 2, and labor used to produce 1 yard of cloth equals 2. Capital used to produce 1 calorie of food is 3, while labor used to produce that 1 calorie of food is 1. So production possibilities can be influenced by both capital and labor. And there's the formula, and that represents a constraint. So we have capital used for each yard of clothing, quantity, capital used for each calorie of food, quantity of food, and then the total amount of capital resources. And then the same is true for labor, where we have labor used for cloth, quantity, labor used for food, quantity of food, and then we have the total amount of labor. So we have a constraint on capital that we cannot use more capital than we have as supply. So there's what our budget constraint looks like. Then we have a constraint on labor, where we cannot use more labor than we have in supply. And that's what that constraint looks like. So economy must produce subject to two constraints. Remember, this is a two-factor model. Without factor substitution, the production possibilities frontier is the interior of two-factor constraints. Max food production is 1,000, which fully uses capital with excess labor. Max cloth is 1,000, which fully loses labor with excess capital. But the intersection of labor and capital constraints occurs at 500 calories of food and 750 yards of cloth. And here's the production possibility frontier without factor substitution, where we have the labor constraint with a slope of -2 and a capital constraint with a slope of -2/3. And then you see point 1, which is we're producing 0 cloth and all food. Point 2, where we're producing all cloth and no food. And point 3 is where the two production possibilities, the constraints intersect. So the opportunity cost is not constant. We have the low and the high. And this is because an economy devotes more resources towards production of one good. The marginal productivity of those resources tends to be low, so the opportunity cost is high. So the above equations did not allow substitution of capital for labor in the production. We held unit factor requirements constant, but if producers can substitute one input for another in the production process, then the PPF curve is bowed. The opportunity cost of cloth increases as producers make more cloth. You can see it in this concave representative, where we have concave down production possibilities. So what does a country produce? The economy produces at the point that maximizes the value of production. An ISO value line is a line representing the constant value of this production, V, which equals the price of cloth times the quantity of cloth plus the price of food times the quantity of food. The slope is the negative ratio of these prices. So here on the production possibilities, you can see the ISO value lines, where the slope is the negative price ratio. So given the relative price of cloth, the economy produces at the point Q that touches the highest possible ISO value line. At that point, the relative price of cloth equals the slope, which equals the opportunity cost of producing cloth. The trade-off in production equals the trade-off according to market prices. So choosing a mix of inputs. Producers may choose the amounts of factors of production used in the production of their goods. Choice depends on the wage, the labor and rental rate paid when rental and capital. So as wage increases relative to the rental rate, producers use less labor and focus more on capital. So here we go. We have input possibilities in food production. So choosing the mix of inputs. Assume that any factor, given factor prices, cloth production uses more labor relative to capital than food production uses. Production of cloth is relatively labor intensive, while production of food is relatively land intensive. Relative factor demand curve for cloth lies outside that for food. So here we go, we can see those here. This is the relationship between the wage rental ratio and the labor capital ratio. So we have factor prices and goods prices. In competitive markets, the price of a good should equal its cost of production, which depends on the factor prices. So how changes in the wage and rent affect the costs depends on the mix of factors used. An increase in the rental rate of capital affects the price of food more than the price of cloth, since food is more capital intensive. Changes in the wage rate and rental ratio are tied to changes in the price ratio. So here we go. We have the factor prices and goods prices, where the relative price of cloth is on the y-axis and the wage rental ratio is on the x-axis. So, another theorem. We have the Stopler-Samuelson theorem. If the relative price of a good increases, then the real wage or rental rate of the factor used intensively in the production of that good increases, while the real wage or rental rate of the other factor decreases. So any change in the relative price of goods alters the distribution of income. So here we go. We have from goods prices to input choices. So, suppose the price of cloth relative to the price of food is calculated by the price ratio. If we also know the direct relationship between relative output prices and relative factor prices given by the SS curve, then we can determine relative factor prices, the wage rental ratio. Once we determine this ratio and determine the CC and FF curves, we can define the capital to labor ratio in both the cloth and food industries. In sum, given output prices, we can determine not only factor prices, but factor levels in the Hecksher-Ohlin model. So an increase in the relative price is predicted to raise income of workers relative to that of capital owners. It's going to raise the ratio of capital to labor services, and it's going to raise the real income or the purchasing power of workers and to lower the real income of capital earners. So how do levels of output change when the economy's resources change? This is the Rybczynski theorem. If you hold output prices constant as the amount of a factor of production increases, then the supply of the good that uses this factor intensively increases and the supply of other good decreases. So we assume an economy's labor force grows. Expansion is biased towards cloth. The ratio remains constant. So here's what that looks like. So an economy with a high ratio of labor to capital produces high output of cloth relative to food. Suppose that home is relatively abundant in labor and foreign is in capital. Likewise, home is relatively scarce in capital and foreign in labor. So home will be relatively efficient at producing cloth because cloth is labor intensive. So let's look at trade in this model. We have countries assumed to have same technology and the same tastes. With the same technology, each economy has a comparative advantage. With the same taste, countries will consume cloth to food in the same ratio when faced with the same relative price under free trade.